The fall of Berlin was one of the final major offensives of the Second World War in Europe, and in 16 brutal and shocking days, thousands of soldiers were slaughtered on both sides. It was during the battle that Hitler decided to end his life inside of the bunker, and in the ruined city, his corpse was burned, along with his wife's Eva Braun. But many members of the Nazi Party were then on the run, and some attempted a breakout, and the stories of powerful Nazis, such as Martin Bormann, were not finally discovered until decades later, as their remains lay inside of Berlin. The city was a complete bloodbath, and eventually on the 2nd of May 1945, the unconditional surrender of the Berlin city garrison was offered and accepted, and the Battle of Berlin then brought an end to the Second World War in Europe. The Soviets then occupied the city, and they came across a number of corpses, and those men who had been classified as deserters by the Nazis who had been executed, and many were strung up from lampposts. But what is the story of these executions? Join us today as we look at the executions of the Battle of Berlin, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. At the beginning of April 1945, the Soviet Red Army were closing in on Berlin. A force had been gathered on the west bank of the Oder River, and General Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front were getting ready to attack the Selo Heights, which was the last line of defence before Berlin. There was a rivalry between Soviet generals as to who would break through to Berlin first, but in the advance towards the city, there had been a huge amount of loss inside of the Soviet Red Army. But there were pockets of ardent Nazis who were willing to fight to the death to defend the remaining parts of Hitler's Third Reich, but to the Germans inside the city, they must have been incredibly fearful as to what would come at the hands of the Soviets. One Soviet soldier claimed, many Germans seemed to feel that they were going to die anyway, so they might as well die fighting. German people joined the Volkssturm, and these civilian troops were armed with whatever they could find, and they were prepared to defend against the Soviets. The Soviet offensive on Berlin began on the 16th of April 1945, as two army groups attacked from the east and from the south, and a third group then attacked German positions from the north. The aim was for the city to be encircled, and this is what happened following the Battle of Selo Heights and Halba. The artillery was constant, and the Soviets fired around 2 million shells onto the city, causing a huge amount of damage to the city's buildings, reducing much of it to rubble. With this, Berliners had to take cover in their cellars or wherever they could in shelters, as they were terrified at what would come, and they did have reasons to be fearful. German women inside of the city were targeted by the Soviet forces and were assaulted en masse, with dozens of thousands of assaults taking place when the Soviets entered the city. They began to understand that there was a hunting hour, where Red Army soldiers would practically hunt for women to commit horrific crimes and actions upon. There were very few fixed defences in Berlin, and the urban fighting and landscape did allow defenders to fight in close quarters, and they had a significantly better knowledge of the region than the attackers, giving them a slight but small advantage. But they were encircled, and the city was cut off for supplies. But the Red Army assault was ferocious, and tanks rampaged, causing further chaos. There were even children, teenagers, who were fighting the Soviets, with the Hitler Youth trying to destroy Soviet tanks when they could, trying to ambush them with Panzerfaust and other bombs, but most of the defenders knew that their fight would be in vain. One shot from a German pistol, and the Soviets would turn huge artillery fire on the position, reducing the buildings to rubble in that area. The Soviets began to understand that most were sheltering in cellars, and some even threw grenades in these underground shelters, not caring about the civilian costs or lives. Hitler was of course inside the city, inside his Führer bunker, and as the battle continued, and as the situation became very desperate, he decided to take his own life inside of the bunker, and he would do this on the 30th of April 1945. But many people inside of Berlin began to hang white or red flags from windows to offer either their surrender in the hope of saving their lives, or a red flag which was meant to welcome the Soviets into the city. However, this was a sure sign to groups of SS executioners and firing squads who had been given the order to execute any civilian or soldier who surrendered to the enemy or refused to defend the city. To terrify people, Adolf Hitler had previously given an order that claimed, "Anyone who proposes or even approves of measures detrimental to our power or resilience is a traitor. He is to be shot or hanged immediately." This meant that Hitler expected everyone to give their lives to fight for the Nazis and to defend the Third Reich at all costs and what remained of it, and he saw German civilians or soldiers who refused to do this as the worst of the worst. The atmosphere inside of the city was horrific within the German population, and they had nowhere to go. They were surrounded, and the only thing they could do was try and risk their lives to break out, or risk capture at the hands of the Soviets, who many feared more than death. Children and the elderly were forced to defend Berlin, and one 19-year-old man who was forced to fight claimed, "To desert was never an option, it meant the death penalty." Another man who experienced the battle as a child outlined the cruelty of those SS officers who executed those inside of Berlin who were said to have been cowards. He claimed, "Anyone that put a white bandage on their arm to surrender was hanged by the SS. I saw them hanging there. For one of them, I even had to write a sign saying I am a coward. I wanted to deliver the German Reich to communism. There was one poor soldier at Steglitz Town Hall and another near my place. It was the worst thing I experienced as a boy." The SS willingly patrolled the city, looking for those to execute, as the order had been given for them to do this, and they hanged them from anything they could find. The reason they did this was rather medieval, as it was done to strike fear into the hearts of the Berlin population, and to keep them away from refusing to fight the enemy. Any civilian who was found attempting to surrender to the enemy fell victim to the SS, and their bodies were then dumped at crossroads or bridges, and even in town squares and public areas. One man at Zienkirchplatz was executed for raising the white flag from his window, and in another area a German soldier was hanged from a lamppost, and a sign placed around his neck that read, "I, Sergeant Lehmann, was too cowardly to defend women and children." But the conditions inside of Berlin got a lot worse, as the electricity supply was cut off and the food supply dwindled down, and also the water and sewer systems became crippled, and there was also a problem with hunger, which led to more people to ditch the war effort and to try and avoid any form of injury at the hands of the Soviets. There were more executions carried out during the Battle of Berlin though, and inside of Plötzensee prison, one of the most notorious Nazi prisons, there were 30 prisoners who were executed during the battle. The Gestapo slaughtered political prisoners who they were worried about falling into the hands of the enemy. But it was during the Battle of Berlin that some of the most barbaric fighting of the last century took place, as every house and street became key to the Soviets. The Germans inside the city who were fighting were willing to lay their lives down, and a number of these soldiers were just teenagers and boys who were killed in the fighting. After the war, the Soviets cleaned up as much as they could, as did civilians, but the damage had been done to the people and the city. Mass graves held the bodies of hundreds, and corpses lay all over the streets, and the city held many different secrets that are still debated today, such as the fate of many remaining Nazis who tried to make a break for it at the end of the battle. But the executions of the Battle of Berlin were ruthless, and they highlighted the Nazi Party and their brutality, forcing people to fight and defend the last remaining heart of the Reich. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.